Welcome to the World War I podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. I'm your host, Amanda Williams. Join me as we explore a wide range of interesting topics related to World War I. This podcast is sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. This is the second part of a two-part interview about Edward Mandell House, better known as Colonel House, Woodrow Wilson's closest advisor for many years. So he's not an official member of government. What do his contemporaries think of him? And you mentioned earlier that he plays a big role in picking many of the cabinet members, but does he ever clash with them or with, State Department officials or other members of government?
Mm-hmm. I will say that Colonel House is very good at being behind the scenes. He is not showing up in the papers, and so it's not like reporters are asking cabinet secretaries or senators or anything about what House is up to. It happens every once in a while, but he's good at flying below the radar. And you're absolutely right. I mean, he helping to pick these people, and some of them being his, real friends, insulates him a lot from the cabinet. Though there certainly are questions by a couple about who he really is and what his role is while he's in Europe. But really the biggest clash he seemed to have with Wilson's inner circle was with Edith. Woodrow Wilson's first wife, Ellen, dies in the White House in 1914. By all accounts, she and House had a perfectly pleasant relationship. She and the daughters had stayed with House a couple of times in New York over the course of 1912. But after her death, and when Woodrow Wilson and Edith start dating or courting or whatever we want to call it, in 1915, I think that House and Edith sort of recognize in each other that the other is the biggest competitor for Wilson's attention. And unlike Ellen, I'll just say, I feel like the dynamic was very different because Ellen is a very intelligent and well-read person. She is a long-standing advisor to her husband, and helped write speeches and all kinds of things. But her main contribution maybe to Wilson as a politician was she was an incredibly valuable advisor when it came to interpersonal things. So she was really great at saying, if you want to get this thing that you want done, then you need to talk to this guy, and maybe we could have a dinner party, and or these are the couple of people, and they know Mr. X really well, and we need to get him on side. So let's talk to the friends first. She was great at helping him navigate political situations, but not usually making specific political or policy suggestions and advice, that sort of a thing. And also, they are married for almost 30 years when she dies in the White House. So when House comes along as this new confidant, Ellen is not threatened by him at all. She knows her standing and is very secure in it. But when Edith is being courted, one of the ways that Wilson woos her is kind of with the presidency. I don't want to make it sound like Edith is like power hungry and she's only interested because he's living in the White House. But he is bringing her into very high level confidences, and she gets to see military and diplomatic correspondence and letters from folks in Europe, from diplomats and leaders, and also some houses. And I suppose I don't know exactly what that feels like. I personally have never been wooed by a president of the United States, but it feels like the sort of thing that would be quite effective. And Edith felt very valued, and it certainly didn't hurt that Wilson is spending a ton of time with her, as much as he possibly can, and writing multiple letters back and forth to her every day. And people in the government and around Wilson recognize this, and they're like, this is a lot of time. She's getting a lot of attention. House, primarily being in Europe during this time, even is also aware of it. But while there are a number of people in sort of Wilson's inner circle that Edith doesn't like right away, his private secretary is a man named Joseph Tumulty, had been with Wilson since the governorship. Edith didn't really like him at first, but eventually comes around when she sees how useful and important he is to Wilson. She does not like House at the beginning, and she does not like House at the end. She never really warms to him. And at one point, she says to Wilson about House, he looks like a weak vessel, and I think he writes like one very often. Um, she, I think, was pretty perceptive about how the sort of sycophantic way that House would write directly to Woodrow Wilson. And in the beginning, Wilson defends House and says, I'm sorry you feel that way, but he said things like the quote you gave earlier, that he's my second personality. He let her know how important House was to him, but that wasn't enough, I suppose, for Edith. And House in later years will claim that this was the beginning of his waning influence with Wilson. When Edith comes on the scene and is so firmly ensconced, and they're married in December of 15, that is the beginning of the decline of House's involvement and influence on Woodrow Wilson.
So we'll talk about that kind of waning relationship in a minute, but can you share with us how you think House shaped Wilson's vision of peace and kind of an idea of an end game for World War One?
So to go back to Philip Drew, administrator, for just a moment, in that book, House has this idea that if the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany all figured out a way to work together, they could institute this new, stable world order that would be in all their interests. I guess what's unsaid in that is that it wouldn't have been in the interests of anyone else really in the world. But that wasn't what they were interested in. They didn't care about Africa or South Asia or anything like that. But it sort of shows that he has this idea of nations coming together to sort out differences well before the war. And this view certainly evolves because of the war. Later on, House is talking about similar ideas, but not including Germany in them because, they're the bad guy now. But and just in general, House hews much more closely to the British and the French. Again, I'm sure it didn't hurt that his dad was English. But when it comes to once the United States has joined and there is really serious discussion about what the end game looks like, House is very supportive of Wilson's pursuit of a League of Nations. Wilson gets a lot of credit for this idea, and it's not something that he thought up out of thin air. But House is very supportive of it, and so supportive that in 1918, House is one of the ones who is helping to create what becomes the 14 points speech that Wilson gives that outlines American war aims and how the world should be different. He gives that in January of 1918. And a little bit later in the year, House is tasked with writing a draft constitution for a League of Nations so that Wilson will have something in hand when he goes to Europe. And I mean, House is also a very important part of the broader peace process when the war ultimately comes to an end. He is part of the American delegation in France already when armistice comes. And I think this is the first time where House kind of had some power invested in and of himself. He was there meeting with high officials and talking about these grand ideas about what the world should look like now that this war has finally ended, this war to end all wars that they hoped it would be. And he likes it. I mean, I think he for the first time is very interested in not being behind this chair, but being in the chair. And he even says in his diary, I would have liked the office itself instead of being an advisor to him who held it. And this is the first time that he ever really talks this way. He doesn't directly dissuade Wilson from coming to Europe to be a part of the peace conference. He writes privately that he thinks it's not a very good idea, that he also thinks that if he was made lead negotiator for the United States and he was given some like quality subordinates, and I think the people he picks are Herbert Hoover, future president who was at the time in charge of all the relief efforts in Europe, and William McAdoo, who was the Secretary of the Treasury. He thought that if it was the three of them in charge, with him, of course, with Colonel House at the head, they could get a peace treaty done in a couple of weeks.
Wow, what an interesting combination.
I mean, I
Yeah.
think he needs a money guy,
Yeah.
and he needs someone who will be helping to deal with like refugees and the
Right.
populations. And then he's just so brilliant, like Philip Drew was, that he'll be able to figure this out to untangle these knotty problems that had been causing issues in Europe for many centuries. But ultimately, I mean, Wilson does come. There are some who actively dissuade Wilson from going. It's like, no, we need you here. You're the president. But Wilson's like, no, if I need to be there so we can be on the same level, the leader of the United States needs to be on the same level as the leaders of the other nations that are going to be there. And so House uh, is made an official part of the American delegation. The 5 official delegates to the peace conference are Woodrow Wilson, Colonel House, Secretary of State Lansing, General Tasker Bliss, and he is a real general, not a fake colonel like House, and Henry White, who was a career diplomat and the only Republican in the entire delegation, and that's another story. But House is essentially put second in command. I mean, he is above the actual Secretary of State. And at one point, another foreign minister calls House the Super Secretary of State, and House thinks that's just great. He thinks that's lots of fun.
I bet.
I'm not sure Lansing would have felt the same way. But he is in the room quite often. He is a part of these very high-level discussions with other world leaders and foreign ministers. And when Wilson has to come back to the United States in mid-February, he goes back for a couple of weeks. They can't, mail the bills that he needs to sign over to him. He has to come back and do some actual governing. He leaves House in charge of the American delegation, though that is where it really all starts to go wrong for the colonel.
Now I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you think Wilson should have gone to the peace conference?
I buy his argument that if the United States is going to be making some fairly powerful demands, the idea of a League of Nations was not new. There were some other similar ideas were being batted around in Europe. The idea that only he could have been the one to push these ideas probably goes a bit too far. But I think if the United States was going to be assertive at that time, considering we had been in the war for such a comparatively short time, it had lost significantly fewer men than any of the, any side, either side, any nation, then it makes sense that you need to have the actual leader. There are places where he does a good job, and I think he being the I think maybe he could be best just compared to the Japanese delegation, because these are two nations who were a part of the war, but are not but are contributing very differently than, say, France or Britain.
Right.
Or Belgium or Russia or something, although Russia's not at the peace conference. But because of that, when the Japanese send a delegation, I think he's a former prime minister who's the leader of it. And when the discussions start being about, well, what should we make the borders in the Balkans be now? The Japanese are like, this is not our business. We should not be involved in this. And they kind of take a step back. And Woodrow Wilson is like, well, I don't have any business in this, but I'm going to take a step forward. And in a lot of ways, it does. A lot of people, especially in Eastern Europe, think that was a good thing to do. Wilson is a powerful advocate for a lot of the little nations in Eastern Europe, and not letting them be divided up by more powerful neighbors. Albania being one of the best examples, I think, of that. And that's the sort of thing that probably wouldn't have happened if Lansing or House, for that matter, or someone like that had been the one in charge of the American delegation.
Point taken. All right. So earlier you alluded to the fact that the relationship between House and Wilson, it is going to begin to fall apart a little bit. So how would you describe their relationship in the final year of Wilson's presidency?
It is essentially non-existent. By 1920, Woodrow Wilson has fully broken with Colonel House. And that is almost entirely due to the peace conference. While Wilson is away, while he's back in the United States, House is left there in charge. And the way House tells it, that as Wilson was leaving, they had a brief conversation where House says something like, there's going to need to be some compromises made if we're going to get this done. And sources differ on whether or not Wilson ignored him or just gave sort of a non-committal answer or what. But House took it as assent, was like, you're in charge, you do what you need to do to get this done. And so he starts making compromises that Wilson had been resisting, some of which were common sense. You had to make some compromises if you were going to get anything done. And it's not like he was saying that, I don't know, Japan now gets to own all of China, or that France gets to, I don't know, create a Berlin city state that will ultimately join France. It wasn't something like that. But there were a lot of questions about reparations, about some border issues, especially between the French and the Germans, that House starts to at least talk about compromises. And when Wilson gets back just a couple of weeks later, he's not happy. I mean, he has a meeting with House to sort of like figure out, where they are to catch up. And he leaves that meeting with his jaw set. And he later says, House has given away everything I had won before we left Paris. More than a little hyperbolic, to be sure. He is not giving up things like the League, or an independent Poland, or what have you. But because of this, genuine or perceived, I think it depends on who you are reading, as they describe it, how real these breaches were. Regardless of that, it's interesting and hard to say whether or not there was really any trust left, because Wilson certainly makes it seem as if there's not. House is not removed from the delegation. He remains in his position as one of the official delegates. He's in some high-level meetings, but I think it's also really interesting in that after Wilson gets back, the way the conference operates changes. Prior to the first couple months, January, February especially, most of the big discussions were held by what they called the Council of 10. And it was the leaders of the delegations, and then usually the foreign ministers, or whoever was in second in command, of Britain, France, Japan, the UK, and Italy. And so this was a fairly large meeting, and they met frequently to discuss whatever issue needed to be discussed. And once Wilson gets back, he shifts to what we think of as the Big Four, these Council of Four meetings, where it is just him and the leader of France and the leader of Great Britain and the leader of Italy in a room. They would meet every day, sometimes multiple times. And at the beginning, I think there was only a translator, and then later there was actually someone taking notes. But there are no other people in that room. House is not in that room for sure. And so you sort of wonder if maybe this break with House was a reason that Wilson is like, well, I have to be the one who's doing all of this. I can't trust anybody else, whether it's House or Lansing or anyone else. So I need to be the one who is in this room all the time. And that is from March of 1919 all the way until at least Versailles is signed in the end of June in 1919. And the last time, I don't think either of them knew this, though maybe Wilson had an inkling, but the last time House and Wilson ever actually meet and speak face to face is just after the Treaty of Versailles is signed on June 28th. And Wilson, they are at the Paris train station. And Wilson is on his way. I think the ship is at Brest. And so he's taking the train to Brest, and then the ship is going to take him back to the United States. He is not coming back to Europe. He's viewing his role in this as done. And House says something like, now that you've gotten this done here, you're going to need to potentially make compromises to get it through the Senate. And again, sources differ, but he is either completely ignored or just, again, given some kind of non-committal answer by Wilson, and the two never speak again. House continues to write reports back and remains in a position in the delegation, but his reports are largely ignored. If Wilson has something he needs done, he's not telling House to do it anymore. And so House, it doesn't take long for House to figure out that he is on the outs in a very real way.
Now, do you think Wilson's failing health has anything to do with the end of their relationship?
I think it certainly didn't help. Wilson is never an especially well man. I mean, I think he had his first stroke when he's 39, and especially in the last few months of the peace conference, he is getting more and more rigid. And he is very sick. I think it's in early April. And then again, a little bit later, I think it's in May. And the medical historians believe that he may have had a mini stroke at one point while he's in Paris. And there's instances of him like saying, being mad that people are moving the furniture in his room around and no one's touching the furniture. He is very short with people. And I'm sure that didn't help with him and House. And I also think Wilson was always one of those people who is, once he has taken in what he feels is the necessary information to make a decision about a thing, he's not really interested in having people tell him that, try to give him more information, I suppose. So while he is thinking these are the set things that the United States needs to achieve and they have to be in the treaty, or none of this was worth it, or the world's gonna, or something bad will happen, when he makes those decisions and House is saying, well, you got to compromise about this, that's not something that Wilson wants to hear. And hearing that a lot from the same person who you are already kind of distrusting, I'm sure didn't help anything.
So when I was doing some research for our talk, it seemed to me that there are two camps of scholars. You've got one camp that seems to write about House, and they highlight the risks of what I guess we could call informal power shaping policy. And then you've got another camp of scholars that seems to emphasize the rewards of such a system. And I think especially now after you brought up the Philip Drew book, I think this is interesting. But what do you think, in terms of the historiography of how people write about House, where do you think he really falls?
Well, I'd like to give a very Colonel House answer and say that I think both camps have valid points. Honestly, the way it is true, he is there in an informal role. He is never, no one ever votes for House, no, not even like Senate confirmation. There's no real accountability to him, and indeed, he largely works behind the scenes and through private communications with Woodrow Wilson. He is shaping nationwide and indeed world events in ways that people aren't aware of. I mean, they don't. He is not a household name by any stretch of the imagination. But in thinking about this question, I was thinking about how very similar roles exist and have existed in the American government, and continue to do so today. Not to get into modern politics for sure, because as a historian, that's absolutely not my role. But the national security advisor position is one that has only existed since the 1950s in like a formal sense. And there are some historians who have called House the first national security advisor, that he is, especially during the war, he is fulfilling a lot of this role of what we would recognize as this role today, the difference being not having a formal title. And so I don't know if I have come down on in the idea of there are, whether which is worse, the risks of the informal power shaping policy, or those who say, it absolutely makes sense. The president needs to be able to have the ability to choose their advisors, and not every person at every single level of the government needs to have, a nationwide vote on them. But I think it's worth considering how House's role compares to the modern national security advisor, because that is another position that, while it is now formal, there's a specific person in a specific office, and they get a specific title, it remains not something that the American public has any say in, and is not Senate confirmable. So in a lot of ways, while they are a bit more in front of the scenes, not behind the scenes, I suppose, there are a lot of similarities and parallels with how some aspects of our government operate today, and how House operated during Wilson's administration.
Final thoughts. What is Colonel House's legacy?
Well, House dies in 1938. He remains a supporter of the Democratic Party. He supports FDR, especially at the beginning. He has some issues with him and during the New Deal. But it really doesn't matter, because House is never as influential in the Democratic Party or with the powerful in general, the way he was with Woodrow Wilson. I think the last person that the last office holder where he was like a close confidant was, oh, now I'm blanking on his name, but he was FDR's ambassador to Germany from 33 to 37. So the first American ambassador to Nazi Germany. And while that was an important role for sure, it was not the same as when you have the ear of the president. House has a couple of tangible legacies. There is a statue of him in Warsaw. It is one of those American statues, or statues of Americans and other Westerners, I suppose, that was destroyed during the Cold War, but then re-erected in the 90s. And because of House's role crafting the 14 points, one of the most important, and for Poland, and not surprisingly, is the recreation of an independent Poland. Because of that, he is viewed very highly in Poland. There is a small town in Texas that's called M House, Emhouse, one word, and it is his initials for Edward Mandell House. It is a tiny little community. I think it's less than 200 people. But it lay on one of the rail lines that he had invested in. And I believe, I don't believe, I know, there was a Liberty ship during World War II that was named the SS Edward M. House. And I think you probably know this better than I do, but there were like 3,000 of them or something, right? I mean, there were quite a lot of Liberty ships that were made in that
Yes.
short period.
They needed a lot of names.
Yes, they did. You got to assume that at some point they were trying to find, okay, who's somebody from history, and we just got to slap a name on it. Had the war gone on much longer, there probably would have been like, what was the foreman's cat's name? And then the SS Dr. Snugglepuss is on its way across the Atlantic.
Right.
But there is a Liberty ship that's named after House. And the historical view, I mean, he tries to do what he can to add to it during his life, to explain his actions. In 1921, he writes a book that definitely doesn't have a passive-aggressive title called What Really Happened in Paris. Excuse me, What Really Happened at Paris. And, it's his version of events. He writes this while Wilson is still alive. I am not aware of if Wilson read it or if he had a direct response to it. By that point, I mean, he is out of office and remains very physically ill. And so I think there were some things where he just didn't bother engaging. But in that same year, there are also 4 volumes published of the intimate papers of Colonel House. And they're edited by someone else, a confidant, I suppose you could say, of House's, who had also worked with him on the Paris book. But it is primarily drawn from his diary and his letters. So he is doing his best. House is doing his best to provide his version of the history so that when people are studying it, whenever, hopefully, I guess he wanted them to read it in 1921. But as people study it, we have the opportunity to look and see what House is thinking. And again, because his diary is more candid than the way he actually spoke, it means that we get some insights into historical figures that we might otherwise not have gotten. But I mean, the United States and the world of 1921 was so different than it was in 1912. And sometimes that is due to the actions of Woodrow Wilson and his administration, and many more times it is their reaction, to world or national events. And I don't want to pretend that like House is the one who was pulling all the strings. I think that goes much too far, or that he was the indispensable man in the Wilson presidency. But a lot of Wilson's biggest achievements, for good and bad, the good ones, or I should say the good ones and the bad ones, have at the very least the fingerprints of House on them as well. So he is not that hidden historical figure that would explain, would help all the pieces fall into place about why things happened in the 19-teens and 20s the way they did. But he's certainly a fascinating one, and we learn a lot about this period, especially by studying this otherwise unassuming man who was so influential on President Wilson.
Absolutely. So if anyone wants to come visit the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library and Museum in Staunton, what do they need to know?
We are a beautiful jewel of Staunton and of the Shenandoah Valley. You get to explore our museum, including an immersive gallery about the World War and a World War I trench replica. We also have his birthplace. The reason we are in Staunton is because Wilson was born here back in the 1850s, and while he may only live here for about 16 months, we're milking that for all we can. And you get to explore not only his origins, but all the things that went on during his life and times. And that includes our archive. We have an archive both available online at presidentwilson.org and for researchers on site. And we welcome anyone to make an appointment with our librarian should they wish to learn more about this incredible transformational period in history.
Well, it's definitely worth a visit, and I enjoy visiting when I get the chance. But thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today and sharing what you know about Colonel House.
It is my distinct pleasure. So good to talk to you.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have questions, comments, or topic suggestions, the MacArthur Memorial team wants to hear from you. You can reach us at MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov or find us on X at MacArthur1880 or on Facebook and Instagram as MacArthur Memorial.